Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Now, in my most recent videos, I've shown you every official Sega release on specific computer platforms like the Sharp X68000 and the Fujitsu FM Towns. And I figured, hey, let's go to that well one more time, and I'm going to show you every single official Sega game released on the Commodore Amiga line of computers. Now, unlike the X68000 and the FM Towns, which each only had a handful of Sega games, the Amiga had a few dozen, so there's a lot more to look at. Because of that, this is a much bigger video and a much longer video. If you want to watch it in pieces and come back to it, hey, that's cool. Throw it on at night and just let it play, also cool. Now before I go on, let me tell you just a little bit about my personal experience with the computer. We had Amigas when I was growing up, back from the launch of the original 1000, then we later got a few 500s, and then a few 1200s years after that. They were the main computer that I used throughout my teenage years for pretty much everything. And there were some great games on the Amiga. You had stuff like Turrican 2, mwah, chef's kiss. So good. So, how do Sega games hold up on the platform? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Amiga platform itself for those that don't know, and then we'll jump into the games. Alright, so here's the Amiga 1000. The first version of the computer released in 1985. This version of the Amiga cost about $1,285 at launch. In 1987, the cost reduced Amiga 500 with mostly the same specs in a wedge form factor sold for about $700 and became the most popular version of the line. Prices continued to drop on the 500 from that point forward. The Amiga headed to the multimedia set-top box market with the CD-TV. In 1992, the Amiga went 32-bit with new graphical abilities with the $600 Amiga 1200. And that machine would serve as the basis for the Amiga CD32 game system that followed later. There were also other advanced models of the Amiga like the 2000 and the 4000, but we're not going to delve too far into that stuff. Let's talk about the original spec of the Amiga 1000 in 1985. It sported a Motorola 68000 CPU, a palette of 4096 colors, from which 32 were available in the most common resolutions and video modes. It had 4-channel digital stereo sound that was split hard between 2 left and 2 right channels, and each were sample-based. The computer featured the capability of handling 2 scrolling planes, and came with 256 kilobytes of RAM at first that was upgradable to 512K, and the Amiga 500 that came along later came with 512K as standard, and very often people would upgrade it to 1 megabyte. The Amiga only had very light hardware sprite support. And I'll also let you know now that the 68000 was of course the same CPU used by many Sega arcade boards and the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive console. How popular was the Amiga? Let's compare it to the other computers that I've looked at recently, the X68000 and the FM Towns. Now remember that the Amiga was released worldwide, while the X68K and FMT were basically only available in Japan. The X68000 line sold a total of about 150,000 units. The FM Towns was a little more successful, selling around 500,000 units. The Amiga, by comparison, sold a total of just under 5 million units. Oddly enough, the Amiga barely even had a presence in Japan, selling only about 10,000 units in that area. The vast majority of Amigas were sold in Europe, nearly 4 million of them. Now I mainly bring that up to drive home the point that the vast majority of software development for the Amiga was done in Europe and the US, which means, you guessed it, none of the games you'll see in today's video were developed by Sega themselves or in Japan. They're all from either European or American software developers, or in a rare case, both. You'll see what I mean. There you go, that's a crash course in the Commodore Amiga line of computers. And as I said before, there's a lot of Sega games available for this thing. It's between 35 and 37, depending on exactly how you count them. What do I mean by that? Well, you'll see right now. We begin with Sega's Action Fighter. It was released into the arcades on their System 16 hardware in 1986. As you can see here, it's basically a souped-up version of Spy Hunter that combines shooting, driving, boating, and even flying. The Amiga version is more closely based on the SMS port of the arcade game than the arcade game itself, so we'll see some differences here. Here's the Amiga version. developed by Core Design. Yes, that Core Design. And released in 1988 by Firebird. And I've gotta say, we're not exactly off to a great start here, are we? Action Fighter is a simple game. Even the Master System version is pretty decent. This Amiga port is just kind of, well, somewhere between terrible and mediocre. Let's call it Terrioker. Anyway, it's choppy, the control is a bit laggy, and there's absolutely no in-game music. Sadly, no in-game music is a problem we'll encounter again as we continue down this list. And that's a real shame considering the sound capabilities of the Amiga. Action Fighter on the Amiga is just bland. It doesn't look good, it doesn't sound good, and it doesn't play particularly well either. Action Fighter wasn't exactly amazing in its original arcade release, but as you can see, the arcade version looks like a masterpiece compared to the Amiga port. Oh well, maybe we'll have better luck with our next game. Yeah, you know this one. Afterburner and Afterburner 2 from 1987 ran on Sega's X board that used dual 68,000 CPUs and had fancy sprite scaling and rotation capabilities. Arcade Afterburner looks and sounds great. Now, the Amiga didn't just get a port of Afterburner, oh no, it got two completely different ports from different developers. Sadly, neither one is particularly great, but one does suck more than the other. So let's start with the bad one. Well, badder. In 1988, Activision published this UK-developed version of Afterburner. That's really a port of Afterburner 2. It was developed by Argonaut Software. Yes, that Argonaut Software. And Software Studios. A name that will live in infamy after you've seen this video. And as you can see here, it's pretty terrible. It takes place in a tiny window. The music, which, hey, at least it has music, is bad and just plays randomly throughout gameplay. And speaking of gameplay, that's pretty atrocious. And basically this game is like going to the dentist, getting a root canal, only instead of your tooth, the dentist accidentally gave you a root canal in your eyeball. Also, without any anesthetic. I mean, come on. This is bad. Really bad. The Amiga was capable of so much more than this. No, it couldn't do fancy hardware sprite scaling and rotation, and in fact mostly relied on software sprites and bobs or blitter objects to perform the function that hardware sprites would do on arcade boards or game consoles. Even so, there are other 3D perspective games on the computer that work way better. That's enough time wasted on this garbage. Let's move on. I guess someone at Sega realized how terrible the Activision version of Afterburner was and hired a company called Weeby Games to do a version specifically for the US market. It came out in 1989 and, well, here it is. I would describe this version of Afterburner as mostly inoffensive, I guess. It still doesn't look too hot, but it definitely looks better than the last version we saw. It's full screen now, and the graphics more closely resemble the arcade original. It is a lot slower than either the arcade game or the top-tier console ports, though. The sound effects are better than the other version, and the music is also. But the problem here is that since the Amiga is limited to 4 sound channels, it often suffers from parts of the music cutting out when sound effects play, and that happens a lot in this game. On the gameplay front, this still isn't all that great. As I said before, it's slow. It's also not very smooth. Your missiles fire very slowly and often fail to hit their targets. The enemy patterns are completely different from the arcade game, taking you out of the US Amiga port a bit as well. Interestingly, this version adds a few boss fights that aren't even present in the arcade version. They seem to have taken a page out of the Sega Master System version of Afterburner for these. So in the end, this version isn't great either, but it's definitely the better of the two. Next up, Alien Storm. It hit the arcades in 1990 on Sega's System 18 arcade board. The System 18 was basically just a slight update to the System 16 hardware that preceded it. Alien Storm was basically a futuristic take on Golden X, employing a similar graphical style and similar gameplay for much of the title. This one does have a few other gameplay styles, including sort of a first-person gallery shooting mode and an auto-scrolling running mode. Alien Storm on the Amiga was developed by Tiertex for US Gold and published in 1991. Tiertex has a well-deserved reputation for pushing out garbage ports of arcade games on the Amiga. And well, The Amiga port of Alien Storm won't exactly change any minds about that. It looks alright in still shots, but this game doesn't even have normal scrolling. It's got weird, jerky push scrolling that happens in chunks at a time when you get near the edge of the screen. The gameplay is just meh for this kind of thing. The collision detection does its best to either make you laugh or curse incredibly hard because it's just not good. Once again, we have absolutely no in-game music. Come on, devs from 30 years ago. If the music was in the original arcade game, you should have been putting the music in your port of it. I can't tell you how much I hated it when they cut all the music out of these games. It made them all so much more boring than they should have been. By the time this game came along, the Amiga's reputation for bad arcade ports was firmly cemented, so it seems like none of the developers or publishers gave a flying f*** whether or not customers actually liked the games they bought, just as long as they bought them. When it comes to Alien Storm, the arcade original was just decent, and the Amiga port of that decent arcade game is a mere shadow of it. The Amiga version wasn't worth anyone's time when it was new, and fares even worse today. The original arcade release of Alien Syndrome came along in 1987 on an arcade board that preceded the System 16 board, but was very similar. And in fact, Alien Syndrome was later released on the System 16B board. Now, Alien Syndrome is a two-player maze shooter that's part Commando, part Gauntlet, and part Ridley Scott's Alien. The Amiga version was developed by Softtech International and published by Ace in 1988. And aside from the weirdo, jerky horizontal scrolling, it actually isn't all that bad. It's definitely not the best port of Alien Syndrome to a home platform, but it's pretty good. I mean, frankly, I'd even prefer the NES version to this one, but it's still okay. And it's got a few other faults that we'll cover in just a moment. First, let's talk about sound. Alien Syndrome has in-game music, so yay for that. But the original Alien Syndrome only had a few songs in it anyway, so they didn't have a lot of work to do on that front. Sound effects are fine, I guess. They do the job even if they're not exactly arcade-like. The biggest problem here, aside from the jerky horizontal scrolling, is that 2 of the arcade game's 6 levels have been cut. Levels 4 and 5 specifically. At least it's still got the final boss at the very end of the game. So we're left with a mostly competent port of Alien Syndrome that can be fun to play, even if it won't ever be anyone's go-to version of the game. The most disappointing thing here is that the Amiga could have done the original arcade game very close to perfectly. Instead, we get an okay, abridged port that is tolerable, but should have been better. The arcade version of Altered Beast was originally released in 1988 on Sega's System 16 arcade board. Yeah, this game gets a lot of flack these days, but you know what? Frankly, it played fine when it was new and there weren't a ton of people complaining about it back in those days. So, sorry revisionists, this game was not always hated, it's a more recent phenomenon. How's Altered Beast on the Amiga? Well, you can see for yourselves. Activision strikes again with a terrible port of a decent game. This one was developed by Software Studios, and is about as much fun as banging your head on a concrete wall repeatedly. Only the concrete wall is also coated with metal spikes. Let's talk about what happened here. First, Altered Beast in the arcade used 3 buttons: punch, kick, and jump. On the Amiga, as with the vast majority of games on the platform, it uses 1 button. This makes playing this game incredibly awkward. You just don't have the same level of control over punches and kicks as you do in the arcade game. Aside from that, as you can see, it looks awful. As you can hear, it sounds awful. And as you can guess, it plays awfully as well. But let's be positive. What's something nice I can say about this game? Well, it's got all 5 levels, and that's about it. Besides that, all 5 of those levels are really cut down and super choppy, and you can see what kind of hit the colors have taken for yourselves. In Arcade Altered Beast, your character goes through 3 human stages of power before transforming into a werebeast. In each stage, he gets larger and more buff. When you pick up your third orb, which would put you in a fourth stage of power, you get to see a close-up of your character's face as they transform into a were creature. In Amiga Altered Beast, there's no change in the size or shape of your human as you collect power-up orbs. And then the beast transition that happens when you pick up the third power-up orb, it's just gone. You're just human 1 second and a beast the next. Amiga Altered Beast is a mild disaster that no one should ever have to suffer through. Altered Beast is just another game on the Amiga that could have been done close to perfectly, but instead we got a quick cash grab that is best relegated to the dustbin of history. Play the arcade version or the Genesis version instead of this one. Next up, for a change of pace, we'll be looking at a Sega port for the Amiga that came from a Genesis/Mega Drive game instead of an arcade game. Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, known as Naomichi Ozaki Super Masters in Japan, was released in 1989 around the launch of the system in the US. I'm not big on golf games and know nothing about real golf except that I can't tolerate more than about 3 seconds of it on TV. Anyway, the original Genesis game, it's okay. It's nice and detailed, it has surprisingly good music, and it plays well enough, I guess. This one is also well known for its hidden Fantasy Zone minigame. Neat. A year later, the game was ported for publisher Elite to the Amiga, and as you can see, they stripped this game down to its bare minimum, removing a lot of what made the original fun. The environments are way scaled down, to the point of being pretty much unrecognizable. Those surprisingly good songs from the Genesis game? All gone. No music for you, Amiga fans. Gameplay-wise, we get an updated, simplified menu, but the gameplay itself is basically similar. Overall, Tournament Golf isn't the worst of the Sega ports that ended up on the Amiga, but it still isn't all that great either. The Genesis original is far superior to this version.
How many rows of advancing aliens are there at the beginning of the game Space Invaders? A, are there 5, or B, are there 6? Rich?
6.
No. 5 is the answer.
Next up, we have Bonanza Brothers. It ran on Sega's more powerful System 24 arcade hardware, known for its higher resolution and higher color graphics than the standard System 16 board. That's why this game has such a clear, colorful look. As I've mentioned in prior videos, Bonanza Brothers is not my favorite game, but a lot of people enjoy its simple stealth action combined with its bits of wacky humor. The Amiga version comes to us from Tiertex. But this time, I'd say they actually put out an acceptable port. Amiga Bonanza Brothers is not as smooth, sharp, or colorful as the arcade game, but I'd say that it looks, plays, and sounds fine for the most part. The way it reduces the 2 action buttons down to 1 is a bit annoying though. You have a single button for shooting/interacting and also jumping. How does that work, you may wonder? Well, you tap the button quickly to shoot and hold it down for a little bit to jump. Now that little change makes the game fundamentally more frustrating than the arcade original, since jumping is not an instant action. Now you can adjust the sensitivity for how long you have to hold the button before it counts as a jump, but even so, it's the worst thing about this version of the game. Now despite this problem, Bonanza Brothers fundamentally plays and behaves like the arcade game, which is more than I can say for the vast majority of Sega ports on the Amiga. This version even has the bonus rounds from the arcade game, which were missing from the Genesis port. Although, to be fair, the Genesis version is unquestionably better than this one in every other way. Still, as far as Sega ports to the Amiga go, and as far as games developed by Tiertex go, Bonanza Brothers is one of the better ones, which is frankly kind of shocking. Next up, we have Crackdown. Crackdown was another release on Sega's System 24 arcade board, this time in 1989. This one is a bit more of a tactical action game that requires careful map navigation, thoughtful action, and strategic thinking. It also splits the screen for 2 players, even in 1-player mode. You might even recognize some of the music you hear in this game if you're a fan of arcade Shadow Dancer. Crackdown is an interesting change of pace if nothing else. The Amiga port of Crackdown was developed by Arc Developments for US Gold in 1990. Yeah, it looks a little sloppy and runs in the normal low-resolution mode of the Amiga, so it doesn't come anywhere near to looking as neat or clean as the arcade original. But it still does look and play basically fine. And hey, we've even got in-game music. Hooray for that. Amiga Crackdown is a decent port of the arcade game, and fares a little better than most of the other Sega ports we'll see in this video. It doesn't play exactly the same as the arcade original, but it's way closer than most of the other games we've seen or will see in the rest of this video. So overall, Crackdown isn't exactly a super complex game, but as we've seen, other developers screwed up other games that were even simpler pretty badly, so credit where it's due for this decent port. Dynamite Ducks is a silly System 16 beat-em-up from 1988 featuring large ducks who punch, kick, and use a variety of strange weapons against their wacky cast of foes. It's got weirdly deformed dogs, what I'll refer to as moose capsules, weird sumos that turn red, and more. It's all so hilarious, right? Right? The Amiga port of Dynamite Ducks was developed by Core Design. It's slow and choppy and not a lot of fun to play. Everything is worse than the arcade original, and the collision detection especially can be a problem in this game. Sometimes you've got to be literally right on top of something to even register a hit. I mean, it's much easier to hit things with weapons, and you'll spend much of the game armed in one way or another, so at least it helps address that a little bit. But the collision detection was way better in the arcade original. Dynamite Ducks is a slow, boring plod that's not much fun to play either alone or with a second player. Sure, the arcade original had its problems as a game, but they're all amplified several times over in this Amiga port. The pace of this game makes the levels feel like they last forever. It's as if you could get pregnant, have a baby, raise it, and send it off to college in the amount of time it takes to complete one level of this game. Is that an exaggeration? No, not at all. Dynamite Ducks has music, so yay! Glad to see they didn't just cut it all out. Where does Dynamite Ducks sit in the pantheon of Sega ports to the Amiga? I'd say it's kind of in the middle of the pack. Let's call it the lower middle. It's a so-so port of a so-so game. Sega pumped out arcade E Swat in 1989 on their System 16 arcade hardware. It was basically Rolling Thunder crossed with Shinobi crossed with RoboCop. People may know E Swat better from the Genesis/Mega Drive version, which is an entirely different game with the same basic theme. This one is just a pure action game, and while it can be mighty unfair at times, it's still pretty fun and interesting, and I enjoyed it in the arcade. E Swat on the Amiga? I covered this one a while back, and just frankly, it's garbage. It's garbage, by far the worst game that you'll see today. This abomination was developed by Creative Materials for US Gold in 1991. And whoo boy is it a stinker! How bad is Amiga E Swat? On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the best game and 10 being the worst, I would rank it as shit. Translated into a number, let's call that 1,000,000. The graphics are a joke, and the characters look like they were drawn by 5-year-olds. They didn't even try to reproduce the parallax scrolling from the arcade game, which the Amiga could have easily handled. Once again, there's absolutely no in-game music in this game. The gameplay, such as it is awful. This was another 3-button arcade game squashed down to 1 for the Amiga. Jumping up and down between different planes in this version can be both a complete chore and easy to do by accident. How do you arrive at a situation like that? Oh, ask Creative Materials, they mastered it. E Swat is the kind of game that should have been right in the Amiga's wheelhouse. Instead, it represents everything that was wrong with arcade ports to the system and why they have such a bad reputation as a whole. For a bonus laugh, you might want to check out some magazine reviews of this game from when it was new in the UK. You might recognize a name from someone that works on a huge channel today that gave this game a laughably sky-high review score back then. I think you'll be surprised. I know I was. Needless to say, E Swat is junk that should be avoided at all costs unless you want to laugh at how terrible it is. G-Lock came out in 1990 on Sega's Y board, which was ultra powerful, employing 3 68,000 CPUs. It was a sprite scaling and rotation monster of a hardware board that was beyond most of its arcade competition of the time, and well beyond what was available to consumers at home. G-Lock itself is, well, kind of a lame follow-up to Afterburner 2, unfortunately. It lacked the speed, excitement, and exhilarating soundtrack of that game. But it sure looked nice, at least, with some pretty fancy scaling effects and nice texturing on the ground. G-Lock on the Amiga was developed by a company called Images and published by US Gold in 1992. Frankly,
it stinks.
Regular viewers of the channel may notice something here. This game bears more than a passing resemblance to Afterburner 3 on the FM Towns, doesn't it? It's a little choppier than that game, and doesn't have quite as much on screen at times, but it generally looks very similar to that one. Yet again, we have another game with no in-game music at all. The gameplay is extraordinarily bland, lacking any real hook or anything compelling to keep you playing. No matter which control option you go with, it just isn't fun. The only positive thing I can say about the Amiga port is that the transition effect to and from the cockpit is kind of neat when it happens, but really, that's about it. If you feel you have too much excitement in your life and need something exceedingly dull to tone things down, then hey, the Amiga version of G-Lock might be just what the doctor ordered. Otherwise, I can't think of a game that's less essential to experience than this one. Galaxy Force 2 is another game that ran on Sega's super powerful System Y board, and wow, was this game a sight to behold when it arrived in 1988. I've covered it a few times now, but still, look at this. It's like getting a glimpse of what the future of game graphics would have been like if polygons never happened. As for gameplay, it's a tad simple, but it's still fun. You fire your main guns and energy missiles, navigate interiors, and blow up cores. What's not to like? On the Amiga, Galaxy Force 2 was ported by software studios. And you know, the first level actually leaves you with a pretty decent impression. Sure, it's way cut back from the arcade game, but considering the differences between the arcade game and the Amiga in capabilities, it seems more than reasonable. And hey, even when you get into the first interior area, it still holds up pretty well. I was pretty impressed the first time I saw this many years ago. But everything just kind of falls apart after the first area. Everything after that is just way simplified, and it's just color cycling lines on the ground with no hint of what the environment of the arcade game was actually like. As to the rest of the issues here, the game runs at a fraction of the arcade game's frame rate, it doesn't control as well, your missiles don't always hit, and the speed control is on the keyboard, as it is in a few other Sega ports, so it's not exactly convenient to use. The Amiga port was never going to do anything close to matching the arcade original, and it would have been silly to expect that. Still, except for the first level, they could have definitely done pretty much everything better than they did. And here's the craziest thing of all. Beyond the FM Towns version, this was the second best home port of the era. Sad, isn't it? We wouldn't see something markedly better until the Saturn version was released a few years later. Being the second best home port of the era doesn't mean it's good though. It's not. It's not the train wreck that some of these other ports are. It's just ultimately an unsatisfying rendition of the original. These days, Amiga Galaxy Force 2 is just something fun to check out and see how the developers ultimately translated such a powerful game to less powerful hardware. Since the release of the Amiga port, there have been many superior versions, so there really isn't much reason to come back to this one unless you have some nostalgia for it. I played the game when it was new, and this was the first version of Galaxy Force 2 that I ever experienced. But even so, I didn't have much fun with it when I played it again for this video. Oh well. In 1989, Sega released its fantasy beat-em-up Golden X into the arcade on their System 16 hardware. It was a huge hit in its day and became an instant classic. Golden X was released on the heels of an explosion in popularity for the genre, and nestled itself right into the gaming consciousness as one of the most memorable scrolling beat-em-ups of the era. In 1990, Probe developed a port for the Amiga that was published by Virgin Games. And, well, hey, this one's actually not too bad. Probe isn't exactly a name synonymous with quality in the computer scene, but credit where it's due, they did a nice enough job on this game. Amiga Golden X retains just about everything from the arcade original. It includes the 3 characters, 2-player simultaneous play, all the levels, all the enemies, and all the rideable creatures. When it comes to play mechanics, they're here too, of course, but the arcade game's 3 buttons have once again been reduced to 1, as you probably expected by now. You use combinations of the joystick directions and fire button for various attacks and jumping. You use the Alt keys to unleash your magic, depending on which player you are. Player 1 is left Alt, player 2 is right Alt. It's a little messy, but it mostly works okay. Visually, the frame rate and colors take a noticeable hit when compared to the arcade game, but it still looks okay and is recognizable enough that you won't mistake it for anything other than Golden X. In a few places, it's got a bit more tile variety than the excellent Genesis port, giving this version a more arcade-like appearance at times, particularly at the start of Stage 2, where the background is much more faithful to the arcade game than the Genesis port is. Now, overall, the Genesis version still trounces this one, but hey, they did do a few things better on the Amiga version, and the backgrounds, in some places, are just better and deserve that recognition here. So good job on that, Probe. Musically, it's alright. It's missing some of the music from the arcade original, and what's here is just okay. It's not as good as what you would hear on the arcade or Genesis versions. Those iconic death screams that Sega stole from various 80s action movies are all missing from this one, so don't go in expecting those. They have some new voice samples. For the most part, the gameplay is here, and while it can be buggy at times, it's a fun enough version of Golden X for those who only had an Amiga back in the day. Overall, Amiga Golden X is definitely one of the better Amiga ports of an original Sega game.
Take a look to the right and name this game. Marcelo. Time, Marcelo. Took too long to come up with it. It's Arabian
Ah Hot Rod, a 1988 System 24 game. It's a game that I didn't even know existed until many years after it came out. After finally getting the chance to experience it, I've found it to be a decent overhead racer, but I can understand why it didn't exactly set the world on fire back then. It's fun enough, but let's face it, there's an awful lot of games that are very similar to this one. Now, it does have a few unique wrinkles, like its upgrade shop needing to run over gas icons to stay fueled, and objects not in the race that you can collide with, like trains, cars, oil drums, and more. The arcade version on the left here also seamlessly transitions from one level to the next, which is pretty cool. On the Amiga, Activision published this game in 1990. This one credits only specific people and not a development company. So how did it come out? Pretty well, I'd say. Hot Rod on the Amiga is fun enough to play, and it looks and sounds fine. The control might be a tad sensitive, but it's easy enough to get used to with a little time and patience. Sega fans will notice the reuse of the Fantasy Zone shop theme here in the garage at the end of each race. Neat, right? It's still a bit on the generic side, but it's fun enough. But I've got to admit that not all is perfect in Hot Rod land. One thing that hampers the experience a little is that I'm not sure if they just zoomed the playfield in too much or made the cars too big, but the cars are proportionately larger on the track in the Amiga version than they are in the arcade original. Kind of a strange oversight considering that they did everything else pretty well in this version. Also, Hot Rod on the Amiga is a little too easy once you get the hang of it. The other big problem with this version of Hot Rod is that all the levels are abridged. They're much shorter than the arcade originals, as you can see here. But I'd still say, even with the shorter levels and the zoomed-in gameplay, that Hot Rod for the Amiga is one of its better Sega ports when it comes to gameplay at least. Now here's Last Battle, which released on the Sega Genesis in 1989. In Japan, this was actually a Fist of the North Star game, sort of a follow-up to the game we got on the Master System known as Black Belt in the West. Now, Last Battle is kind of a slow, dreary, dull, early 16-bit game that looked really nice, but wasn't exactly a ton of fun to play. It was also really long and could have either used a save or a password feature of some kind, but nope, it was a one-sitting game in those days. Last Battle was brought to the Amiga in 1991, published by Elite and programmed by the fun assassins at Creative Materials. They've ruined a few games up to this point. Will Last Battle be next? Well, yeah, kinda. On Genesis, we had loads of parallax and faux parallax layers, good use of color, and several large characters all on screen at once. On the Amiga, we see a big color reduction. They removed all of the parallax, including the split-screen fake parallax layers, and there are fewer characters on screen at once. In terms of general content, they actually removed about half of this game on the Amiga version, which I guess could either be a good or bad thing depending on your point of view. Still, 2 of the game's 4 chapters are just gone. As for the play mechanics themselves, they're kinda broken on the Amiga. Once again, we have 3 buttons from the Genesis original, reduced down to 1 on the Amiga port. The fire button attacks, up jumps, and then performing punches and kicks is just kind of a pain. I found low kicks kind of hard to execute. You have to hit diagonally down into the corner and hit the button at the same time. To do a low punch, you just basically duck and press right or left on the joystick. Basically, none of the controls in the Amiga version are the least bit intuitive. And also in the Genesis game, as you take out enemies, it fills out a meter on the bottom of the screen. Once you hit one of those points, your character Arzak will bust out of his shirt and he'll get upgraded, more powerful attacks. In the Amiga version, Arzak stays fully clothed at all times, and he only gets his standing punches and crouching punches powered up. Nothing happens to his kicks, and the multi-hit power-up attacks that he does in the Amiga version are way slower than they are in the Genesis original, which leaves you open to getting attacked by the enemy while you're in the middle of your punch animation. I mean, did anyone playtest this? That is a huge oversight. And then also, notably, the Labyrinth song is missing from this version. Kinda sad they couldn't get all the music in, considering there wasn't that many songs to begin with. All of this is a bit puzzling, because the Amiga version comes on a floppy disk that had close to twice the amount of storage as the cartridge that the Genesis original game was on. When all is said and done, we get a severely cut down version of Last Battle that's missing a lot of stuff from the original. What it retains, it manages to screw up. Amiga Last Battle is another one of those games that's kind of interesting to look at once, but isn't really worth sitting down to play. If you must play Last Battle, and I'm not convinced that you must, play it on the Genesis instead. It's way better than this one. Next up, we've got Line of Fire. Line of Fire was a light gun game that ran on Sega's pretty powerful X board in the arcade. It came out in 1989. It's sort of their take on Operation Wolf, except it's more of a first-person perspective where you move in all directions on rails instead of just left and right. It's mindless fun, and it looks really nice thanks to the impressive hardware. On the Amiga, Line of Fire came out in 1990. It was developed by the Fun Killers at Creative Materials and published by noted purveyors of junk US Gold. So does that mean this version of Line of Fire is a complete mess? Well, mostly. I mean, it's kind of okay compared to a few of the other ports we've looked at today, but it's not a great representation of the arcade game. I mean, visually, considering what they had to work with hardware-wise, they did an okay job. Regarding the gameplay, they did less of an okay job with that. Pretty much everything just starts abruptly, and enemies tend to fire like the split second they get on the screen, and it's just hard to keep up with it and shoot everything that you need to. Once again, we've got no in-game music on the Amiga, which does help make the experience a little more dull. And really, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. You can see what it looks like. The Amiga version is drastically cut down from the arcade, and it's really not that good. I mean, it is kind of fun just to take a look at it to see what sacrifices the developers made to get this game on the Amiga, but as something that you want to sit down and play, nah. In the pantheon of Sega ports that we've looked at today, this one is a below par port of a decent game. Get ready for this one, folks. Outrun was released on Sega's Outrun hardware in 1986. It was kind of a revolutionary driving game back in those days, looking and sounding better than any other driving game that had come before it. It was also all about the journey and choosing which path you took instead of just doing laps around a course. It reached classic status in no time flat and remains one of the most beloved driving games ever made to this very day. In 1989, Probe developed a port of Outrun for the Amiga that was distributed by US Gold. And wow, I mean, this one speaks for itself, doesn't it? Amiga Outrun should be classed as a crime against humanity. They took an absolutely beloved experience and just completely butchered it. This one gets flack in particular for having been a lazy Atari ST port. And all I can say is, this is one of the worst versions of Outrun you could ever possibly suffer through. The graphics are beyond terrible. The frame rate seems to aim for about 1 or 2 frames per second at times. I mean, yeah, I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. It's low. Really low. Artistically, the game is just abysmal. It doesn't even remotely resemble the colorful, eccentric arcade original. We're missing a metric ton of road obstacles, and the game doesn't even properly fork the road at the end of a stage. It just sticks a line of bushes down the center that serves the same purpose. The engine noise and tires squealing are kind of annoying, but tolerable, I guess. The music that's here is the best part of the game, but it's way too quiet most of the time. And there's an annoying bug where the volume of it drops, and I remember that happening on real hardware when I played it back in the day too. I totally forgot about it until I played it again for this video. Gameplay-wise, Amiga Outrun is just a disaster. It's so slow that it borders on unplayable. You can control it with either the mouse or joystick, but it doesn't matter. Either way, you're not gonna have a good time. So Amiga Outrun is another one of those games that helped earn the Amiga its reputation for having awful arcade ports. It ranks right up there with garbage like Double Dragon or Final Fight as some of the worst pieces of junk on the entire platform. If there was a single person involved with this game that cared even a little bit about making a good version of Outrun on the Amiga, it sure doesn't show. If you want to see another early racer on the computer that has a similar visual design, check out Lotus Turbo Esprit or even its sequels. Those games blow this garbage away. So, here's an oddity. Outrun Europa came to us once again from Probe in 1991, after years of delays. This time around, it isn't a terrible port of a great or even a good game. In fact, it's not a port of anything at all. Probe managed to put out a substandard game all on their own without having to base it on anything else. Outrun Europa is sort of like a mashup of Outrun and Action Fighter of all things. You start out on a motorcycle, then later race in a boat, then a few cars. It looks better than the original Amiga version of Outrun, but let's be honest here. That would be an almost impossible bar for it not to clear. Compared to the better Amiga racing or driving games out there, I'd rank it as mid or lower tier. It's really not all that much fun to play. The time limits are very strict even early on, the boat scenes are nigh impossible to navigate, and turning just doesn't control well no matter what vehicle you're in. And really, there's just no reason at all for this vehicle switching. I guess they wanted to add some variety in, but it would have been much better to focus on picking one vehicle and making sure that the controls were good before adding any others. The music by Matt Furness is pretty good in this version of the game while you're playing it at least. It wasn't anything that I had a desire to listen to outside of the game, but hey, decent music during gameplay is a huge plus among this group of games that I've been looking at today, right? Outrun Europa on the Amiga, I have to say, it's just another substandard game that doesn't feel anything remotely like Outrun. They could have called it anything. Nothing ties it into Sega's legendary racer. It's not even close to the worst driving game on the Amiga, but it's also nowhere near the upper tier of driving and racing games on the platform either. Feel free to skip this one, you've already seen enough, I promise. Here's a game I bet most of you aren't familiar with. This is Passing Shot, a tennis game released on Sega's System 16 hardware in 1988. It's a fun enough game, I suppose, even though it wasn't the best tennis game out there even when it was new. Passing Shot is also vertically oriented, which helped set it apart from most home tennis games. It looks fine, it sounds fine, and it's just, well, fine, I guess. It's even got non-intrusive in-game music. Imageworks published the Amiga version, which was developed by Tech Software, in 1989. And this one is less good. First, it's not a terrible port, so we can get that out of the way. It's just a bit dull. It's less polished than the arcade original, it's kind of squashed for the horizontal display, they removed the in-game music, and reduced the game to a single button. In the end, Amiga Passing Shot is an okay-ish port of a superior arcade game that wasn't exactly exemplary itself in the first place. Amiga Passing Shot is fun enough, I guess, and it resembles the arcade game enough that the 5 people who actually cared about this game would have probably been okay with this port and the many compromises made in bringing it to the Amiga. So as a port, Amiga Passing Shot is pretty middle of the pack as far as Sega games go. Would I spend more than 5 minutes playing this game today unless I had to? Nah. Here's Power Drift. It was released into the arcades by Sega on their Y board in 1988. It represented a pretty big jump in computational power, which allowed the developers to make the entire course out of scaling sprites. Sure, it looks chunky or blocky these days, but this was pretty jaw-dropping back when it was new. Now, I went on about the Y board with a few other games at this point, so you know the deal. It was super powerful for its era. In 1989, the quality reducers over at Software Studios brought Power Drift to the Amiga for publisher Activision. Where to start? Visually, Power Drift was going to be a real tough game to bring to the Amiga, or indeed any platform back in the day. And you know, I really don't fault the developers of this game too much for what they ended up with. It's got a lot of the look and feel of the arcade game down, even though it's less detailed, there are fewer components on the screen at one time, and the frame rate can drop to next to nothing at certain points. I've got to say that of the home ports of Power Drift, visually, this might have been the best one there was until the Saturn release. The control is okay. I prefer playing this one with a joystick and setting the sensitivity up to max. Doing that makes it easier to handle the car and navigate the many quick turns of this one. And we've got in-game music again, but it uses the same set of relatively awful samples that software studios used in many of their other Sega ports. Still, I'm glad that there's music at all, I just can't help but wish that it was better. In the end, Power Drift is kind of okay, all things considered. I will say that at least it looks more like its arcade counterpart than Galaxy Force 2 does. So, if you can tolerate the variable frame rate and sudden speed changes when there's a lot of stuff on screen, you might even manage to extract a little bit of enjoyment out of this one.
The animals in Zookeeper are elephants, snakes, camels, rhinos, moose, and what other? I thought you hit the buzzer, but I don't see any light or hear buzz. Did you hit the buzzer?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Push it again. You got it. What do you want?
Zebra.
Incorrect, sorry.
Next up, Scramble Spirits. I'd bet this game is most well known for its Sega Master System version, but we're looking at the arcade original on the System 24 arcade hardware released in 1988. How is it?
It stinks.
If you ask me, it's a boring vertical shmup that lacks variety or anything interesting. Power-ups are rare and easy to lose, and the whole thing just doesn't look, sound, or play all that great. You know, it's kind of funny. The Amiga port of Scramble Spirits came to us from publisher Grand Slam via developer Tech Software in 1990. How is it? As you can see, it ain't great. Jeez. The arcade game, aside from its higher resolution graphics, should have been a piece of cake to reproduce on the Amiga. You had limited enemy types, and the simplicity of the visuals from the original would have been ideal to show off what could be done on this computer platform. But what we get are badly redrawn graphics running at a low frame rate with sluggish controls. Also, the 3 buttons of the arcade original are once again reduced down to 1 for the Amiga, and that makes this game just not very fun to play. Scramble Spirits on the Amiga just once more amplifies all of the issues of the arcade game and makes it a more frustrating experience than it should be. The music is fairly decent, I guess. It's a little bit on the annoying side, but it's there and it plays during gameplay. It's not the worst stuff I've ever heard, but also far from the best. And those button-reduced controls can really be a bit of an issue. The way you launch your bomb attack in the Amiga version is by holding fire when you have side planes attached, which is super annoying because the game also has regular auto-fire that happens when you hold the fire button. If you don't want to fire your bombs immediately when you have them, you have to rapidly press fire to shoot instead of holding it, even though the game has rapid fire built right into it. Why would you do that? Scramble Spirits on the Amiga isn't exactly a tragedy, but it's also another game that's just a so-so port of a so-so arcade game. I'd rather play the flickery SMS version. Here we have SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. Sega released this in the arcade in 1987 on their System 16 arcade board. It's an interesting take on the shmup genre. You control a satellite and a crosshair on screen independently. The arcade game featured a joystick with a button on top and then a trackball to the right of it that lets you control the crosshairs. It also featured 2-player simultaneous play. It's okay, but the game is brutally unfair, especially when you're playing with only one player. The Amiga port was another Activision joint developed by, oh no, Software Studios. And you know what? This is probably their best work on the computer. The Amiga version of SDI is actually pretty okay. The difficulty is toned down from the insanity of the arcade game, and the control scheme using the joystick and the mouse together is great. Yeah, visually it's choppier with a lower frame rate than the original, as you would expect at this point. The levels don't match up exactly with the arcade game, they've taken a few liberties there. You've got that constant spinning SDI logo at the top and the center of the screen for some reason, and it loses some of the details in the translation to the computer as well. But overall they did a pretty nice job here. And yeah, we've got music, how about that? And for a Software Studios game, it actually sounds pretty decent. This must have been before they made what sounds like a generic music sample kit for most of their Sega ports. I've got to admit, I kind of enjoy this one in spite of its rough edges. I had more fun playing this version than the arcade original. Now the Amiga version of SDI is a bit on the easy side. I had no problem getting 100% of the enemies in the first several levels, but I had fun doing it. So you know what? If you want to play SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, then yeah, the Amiga version is a perfectly respectable way to do that. This one surprised me, especially considering the pedigree of the developers. So while SDI may not be the most accurate port out there, especially of a Sega game on the Amiga, it is one of the most fun experiences and one of the best ones to actually play. Sega released Shadow Dancer into the arcades on its System 18 board in 1989. It was the follow-up to their awesome ninja action game Shinobi. And hey, look at this, it has more detailed graphics than Shinobi. But you know what game is better in every way than Shadow Dancer? Yeah, Shinobi. Shadow Dancer looks nice enough, but it's slower paced and more methodical than Shinobi. It has much worse music, some levels that are just a little too long, and more frustrating bonus rounds. Now don't get me wrong, Shadow Dancer is not bad, it's just that it was mostly a step backward from the excellent earlier Shinobi. And you know what else? I find that the Genesis version of Shadow Dancer is way better than the arcade original. Genesis Shadow Dancer is of course a different game with its own set of levels, but it has similar gameplay and frankly fixes most of the issues that are present in this one. The Amiga port of Shadow Dancer came along in 1991. It was developed by Images Software for publisher US Gold. And once again, I've got to say that this one is pretty good. In fact, if you're looking for the closest thing to the arcade game at home in 1991, this was it. It has the arcade levels, all of them are present, all the enemies are accounted for, it's got the power-ups, bosses, and retains the proper gameplay. Amiga Shadow Dancer also has in-game music and most of the songs from the arcade version, but somewhat frustratingly, they don't play in the same order as the arcade original. I do find a few of them a little bit on the annoying side because of the samples they used, but most of the music is tolerable and we also get sound effects. So what are the downsides? Well, the game runs at about half the frame rate of the arcade original, and they removed all the parallax scrolling. And once again, they had to cut the 3-button controls down to a single button. So what does your button do? Well, in this game, it attacks, up jumps, and you use the spacebar for ninja magic. To jump up and down between different planes, you hold the fire button and press up or down depending on the circumstance. Now it works well enough, even if it doesn't quite feel as good or as fast as the arcade game. So Shadow Dancer then? Well, it's one of the absolute best arcade ports on the Amiga. Technically, it's a ways off from matching the arcade original, but it plays like the arcade game, and very much like it, which is more than I can say for a lot of these other games or a lot of Amiga arcade ports in general. Now, there's not really any reason to play this one over the arcade original these days, but in 1991, this was a very good port of the original game, even though it's not quite a great one. It really should have had parallax, but still, good job. Next up, we have Shadow Dancer's precursor, Shinobi. Arcade Shinobi hit the scene in 1987 on Sega's System 16 hardware. It was one of those games that pretty much became an instant classic, and people love it to this day, 35 years later. It's fast, it's fun, it has interesting levels, memorable bosses, and is just an all-around great 2D action game. Top-notch stuff here. Shinobi arrived on the Amiga in 1989, courtesy of publisher Virgin Games and developer Binary Design. Not a company with a great track record again. But let's talk about the elephant in the room right away. Amiga Shinobi is hideously ugly. It looks absolutely terrible. The sprites are atrocious. The backgrounds look terrible and suffer a real lack of color. You may have also noticed the frame rate is, how shall I put this gently? Now get ready for a surprise. Shinobi for the Amiga actually plays pretty well despite all these issues. It's got all the levels, all the moves, the power-ups, the bosses, and most but not quite all of the enemies from the arcade original. It's even got pretty much all the music and voice samples. That's more than we can say of certain other ports. Yeah, it's slow and it's ugly. The control is basically the same as I described for Shadow Dancer just a moment ago. But I've gotta say this game is fun and it plays like Shinobi despite its very obvious shortcomings. Should this game have looked better? Oh, absolutely. I don't see how you justify these awful graphics. Even so, I've gotta admit that it's quite playable and worth taking a look at, either for laughs or to be surprised by how shockingly decent the gameplay is. I mean, they even managed to stick in the parallax scrolling despite the overall choppiness of this game. So Shinobi is not one of the best Sega ports for the Amiga, but it is one that is against all odds actually pretty fun to play. Also in 1987, and also on the System 16 board, Sega released this game. Sonic Boom. This is another one that I'd be willing to bet most people have never heard of. And you know what? It's even less remarkable and duller than Scramble Spirits. It's a simple, generic, vertically scrolling shmup that does absolutely nothing to distinguish itself as a must-play game. On the Amiga, Sonic Boom was released in 1990, after being developed by Source for Activision, and it falls into the category yet again of a so-so port of a so-so original game. What we get here is a port of the arcade version that is significantly downgraded with a lower frame rate, weird music, and most of the content from the arcade game. The control is a little sluggish once again, hurting the overall experience a bit. Now, if you thought the arcade version of Sonic Boom was as boring as a vertical shmup could be, the Amiga version says, hey, hold my beer. It's dull, and frankly, I'm not going to waste any more time showing you any more of this game. Sonic Boom is a forgettable arcade game from Sega with an even more forgettable Amiga port. It's not even that it's a bad game, it's just there. Next up, we've got Space Harrier, a game that needs no introduction, but I'm going to give it one anyway. Space Harrier came out in 1987 on Sega's aptly named Space Harrier hardware. Space Harrier looked amazing, it played great, had one of the most memorable soundtracks in a game to date, and was just a fantastic way to spend a few minutes. Space Harrier arrived on the Amiga in 1989 from publisher Elite, or I should say, half of it arrived. This version of Space Harrier only has the first 9 levels, and then a boss rush for level 10. So how is what's here? I've got to say, despite some rough edges, this one's actually pretty good. No, it doesn't really feel like the arcade game, but as for a way to play a decent version of Space Harrier at home in 1989, well, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better solution. The biggest visual deficiency here is that it's missing the ceiling coming down in stages like 4 and 9, where you have to dodge the bins beans and fight enemies in between. The sound and music, they're pretty great. The firing sound effect is less abrasive than the arcade original, but the explosion effect is a little worse. The music is a very nice rendition of the arcade game that has its own distinct flair. Now for this version of Space Harrier, you use the mouse to control it, and that's a great solution. The graphics are pretty smooth and the game moves super fast. The iconic checkerboard floor is present even though each square is about 4 times bigger than it should be. The biggest problem here is that the enemies and enemy fire move so fast that it can be easy to get killed without ever seeing what it is that got you before it hits you. So if you go to try this version out for yourself, yeah, expect that to happen a lot. Now I enjoyed this one when it was new and I played it so much back then. It's not super great these days, but in that pantheon of Sega arcade ports, this is absolutely in the upper echelon. But wait, you say, it's only half the game. How can you be okay with that? Well, that's because Elite followed that release later in 1989 with this game, Space Harrier Return to the Fantasy Zone. It contains levels 10 to 18 of the original game, plus another boss rush at the end. So with these two games combined, you get all of Space Harrier and basically get an extra level between the two games. Now there are a few differences in this game versus the first Space Harrier release. The developers added some more color to the checkerboard and the backgrounds. They made your fire a little more rapid, and in general they buttoned up the gameplay a little bit. It mostly feels like an add-on to the original, but hey, at least they actually did go back and do some work to improve the game, even if it was just a bit. In the end, Space Harrier and Space Harrier Return to the Fantasy Zone together represent a pretty well-made port of a visually complex game, and one of the more impressive Sega ports that ended up on the Amiga.
We'll take a look at the name of the game board, and name this game. Yes, Alex.
Mappy?
No, Mappy is not right.
Next up, we've got Space Harrier 2, which was a Genesis/Mega Drive original game. It arrived in 1988 in Japan and 1989 in the US. It was one of the earliest Genesis games Sega had ever worked on. The checkerboard floor animation is great and looks almost as good as the arcade original. The rest of the game is really choppy, which can make it a challenge to focus at times. Even so, I've always liked this game and found it fun to play, and I appreciate the more unique bosses in it. I would love to have seen what it would have been like if Sega had released this game a little bit later in the system's life. Now, Space Harrier 2 was ported to the Amiga in 1989 by Tech Software for Grand Slam. It's similar to the Genesis game, but some things stand out. First, the floor isn't as smooth in this version, but the character and enemy movement is slightly smoother. Gameplay-wise, it doesn't feel as good as the first game on the Amiga, nor as good as the original Genesis game. The controls just feel less responsive. Now, Amiga Space Harrier 2 is certainly not a terrible game by any stretch, but I would say it's a bit below average. Aside from being slow, the game speed will dip even more when there's a lot happening on screen, such as the stages where the ceiling drops down, which it's nice to see that included at least, but there's a definite performance hit. As a Sega game ported to the Amiga, Space Harrier 2 is okay, I guess. There are far worse Sega games on the platform, but this should have really been better. Next up, we've got another Superscaler port in Super Hang-On, Sega's follow-up to their early racer, Hang-On. It came out in 1987 and ran on the Outrun hardware. It was a big improvement to the original game in a lot of ways, and I find is kind of an unappreciated racer these days. The big addition that Super Hang-On added to the mix was the use of the Nitro button to get a big turbo boost, and you could maintain it for as long as you could hold your max speed. The concept works a lot better in this game than it would in the later release of Turbo Outrun. Now, Super Hang-On arrived on the Amiga in 1988. It was published by Electric Dreams and was developed by... No, this can't be right. Software Studios? But I'm shocked, because they did a fantastic job on the Amiga port of this game. Strange that their early games like this and SDI was so well done, while their later stuff pales in comparison. I don't know what happened to that company. Anyway, yeah, Super Hang-On on the Amiga may actually be my favorite home port of the game, believe it or not. It's not as smooth as the arcade game and the bikes are a bit smaller, but if you use joystick control and set the sensitivity to max, this game plays great. The only real challenge to this one comes from the X68000 port, which is a little more impressive when it comes to graphics and sound, but I think on the gameplay front, I might even give an edge to the Amiga version. Despite being one of the earlier Sega ports to the system, this may well be the very best of the entire bunch. It's an absolute joy to play. It looks good, the music is pretty good, and even though it's not as nice as the original arcade version, it's just plain fun to play. So yes folks, I think I'm going to officially dub Super Hang-On to be the best port of a Sega arcade game on the Amiga. Super Monaco GP was released on Sega's X-Board in 1989. It was Sega's attempt at a realistic Formula 1 style racer, and it was super impressive visually for the time that it came out. It plays well, and as an arcade experience, totally fine. But the game's limited content definitely made it something that wasn't exactly perfect for home port material. The Amiga port of Super Monaco GP was published by US Gold in 1991 and was developed by Probe Software. I guess because they did such a bang-up job on Outrun. Amiga Super Monaco GP is incredibly scaled back visually when compared to the arcade original, which is not much of a surprise. The frame rate, again, is a fraction of the arcade originals, and it's also a lot slower and doesn't control as well either. Taken on its own, I suppose it's a limited but serviceable version of the arcade game, but it's really not great. And the thing is, as a home game in general, the amount of stuff in Super Monaco GP is so limited that it really needed more. In this case, we get a below-average port of a great 5-minute arcade experience that ends up in the large pile of below-average Sega titles on the Amiga. Sega released Thunderblade in 1987 on their X-Board, and you've probably heard me rant and rave about how amazing this game looked back when it was released. But hey, I've got to say it again, it sure was something. It's visually very complex, and there was nothing like it at the time. The overhead scenes, you had full control over your height, and you could zoom in and out at will. The third-person chase scenes were as smooth as butter with lots going on. Thunderblade's console ports weren't too hot. Really, only the X68000 version did it any justice on a home platform, and that one was still a ways off from the arcade original. Amiga Thunderblade came out in 1989. It was published by, oh no, US Gold, and was developed by, the butchers at Tiertex. So how badly did they screw this one up? I hate to say this, but Tiertex actually did an okay-ish job here for the most part. This version gets a lot of flack, and as much as it pains me to say this, I think it needs to be cut just a little bit of slack. Could it have been better? Absolutely. But they were able to capture most of the arcade version's gameplay on the much less powerful Amiga with a puny one-button joystick. I mean, yeah, the graphics are less detailed, they're in a small window, the frame rate is low, and the game is really slow. But despite all of that, I think when you just consider everything, that this ended up being a relatively acceptable version of the game, visually at least. There's no in-game music, which is of course a giant minus here, and that's my biggest issue with this one. So anyway, Amiga Thunderblade was never in danger of winning any Game of the Year awards. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a great game, or even a good one, but what I will grant it is that it came out a little better than I would have expected. It was good to see the play mechanics and graphical effects replicated, even if they were nowhere near the quality of the original arcade game. And I do have to give them an extra point or two, because they were porting this from a system that was so much more powerful than the Amiga, but still managed to include most of what made this game unique. In 1987, Sega released one major hit after another in the arcades. But Time Scanner wasn't one of them. This System 16 release is a pinball game with multiple tables and screens. I mean, I guess it's kind of alright for a digital pinball game, but really there's not much compelling about it. And that's probably why we never saw a console port. It's fun enough in short bursts, but it's definitely not a game that I've ever wanted to come back to over and over. In 1989, publisher Activision brought this game to Amiga from developers Forcefield, get it? And once again, Software Studios. Now this game should have been a slam dunk port to the Amiga. It's a visually simple game with hardly anything going on in it. They really only had to do one thing. A respectable job with the ball physics. And guess what they didn't do well? A respectable job with the ball physics. Yeah, on the Amiga, the frame rate is low like most of the ports we've seen. And the music is weird and cuts out when sound effects play, and I could even forgive a lot of that stuff if the ball physics were better. I mean, the ball just kind of judders around slowly and weirdly all over the place, and the controls, shake the machine a whole bunch by accident, and it's just not a good experience. Amiga Time Scanner is not terrible, but the ball is just too slow, and it doesn't react the way that most people would expect from a digital pinball game, leading this to be a less than ideal experience. As a Sega port to the Amiga, Time Scanner is, I'd say, middle of the pack. It should have been better, and I can't imagine it would have taken much more work to fix the minor ball physics problems that we see here. Play it if you must.
In the game Robbie Roto, you must save hostages and treasures placed underground by A, the evil Votar, or B, evil Otto. Bill.
Evil Otto.
No, it's evil Votar, and Linda, you get to pick the next game.
Sega released Turbo Outrun into the arcade in 1989 on the Outrun hardware. As I've said before, it was sort of an Outrun version of Super Hang-On, except it doesn't work nearly as well in this game. Turbo Outrun just removed too much of what makes Outrun Outrun. There are no more branching paths, no more taking in the scenery as you travel the countryside. Now it's all about hitting turbo and going as fast as you can at all possible times, while the screen is cluttered with stuff that makes it really hard for you to see where you're going. US Gold published the Amiga version of Turbo Outrun in 1990 after it was developed by ICE. It's not quite as tragic as the Amiga version of the original Outrun, but it's still not good. The graphics are tremendously cut back, as you would expect, and the frame rate is reduced dramatically. We lose a lot of the music from the arcade game, and it just plays the same two songs over and over, alternating as you clear checkpoints. That's all you get musically for the entire game. And these two songs are not particularly well done either. The song that plays first is really grating, and the song in the even stages is a little bit more pleasant, just so you know what you're in for here. I've got to say, Turbo Outrun is strike 3 for Outrun games on the Amiga. None of the 3 Outrun games on the platform are any good, and this is just another game that would best be left buried in the annals of history. See it here today, take it in, and then my best advice is, don't ever bother seeing it again. Wonder Boy and Monsterland was originally released into the arcades on Sega's 8-bit System 2 hardware in 1987. It was vastly different from the first Wonder Boy game, adding more of an action-adventure feel with light RPG elements versus the pure platforming of the original game. I like the arcade version of this game, and I like it a lot. Wonder Boy and Monsterland hit the Amiga in 1989 from, oh no, Activision. It was developed by Images Design and, oh no, Software Studios. But I'm guessing that Images Design must have done most of the work here, since this game isn't actually terrible on the Amiga. Now, the Amiga should have been able to do basically a one-to-one port of the arcade original, since it was on vastly inferior hardware this time around. And we get something that isn't quite at that level, but is still pretty good. The Amiga version is a bit slower, has a lower frame rate again, and doesn't control as precisely as the arcade original. But despite those things, I'd say this is a pretty respectable home version of Wonder Boy and Monsterland. I like the game, and I played it quite a lot back when it was fresh and new. And if we compare it to a more well-known version, like the one on the Sega Master System, Amiga Wonder Boy and Monsterland actually more faithfully reproduces the arcade game's soundtrack and includes much more of the original music than that version did. So good on them for the soundtrack. As far as the controls go, you have to deal with moving up on the joystick to jump since it's reduced to a single button, as you might expect, and the fire button controls your sword swinging. And you might be wondering, if up jumps and the button uses your sword, how do I enter doors in this game? Well, my retro gaming friends, you've got to hit the spacebar in front of a door to enter it, which is not an ideal situation. Now, in the end, we're left with a pretty good port of a pretty good game this time around. I wish this had been the last game on the list to look at today so that I could end this on a positive note, because Amiga Wonder Boy and Monsterland is just plain old good fun. But alas, there's one final game we need to look at. Here's World Championship Soccer. In your part of the world, it may have been known as World Cup Soccer. It came out for the Genesis/Mega Drive in 1989. And you know what? It kinda stinks.
It stinks.
I don't like this game at all. There are soccer games on many systems over the years that I've enjoyed quite a lot, and this is just not one of them. It's pretty ugly, it's not fun to play, the computer AI is just too good, the controls feel off, and it's a generally unpleasant experience. For some reason, Elite brought World Championship Soccer to the Amiga in 1990. And, well, it's still not good. It's slow and it's choppier than the Genesis/MD original. It's just not fun, and you know what? This has been a super long episode and I'm done. I'm done here. This is a decent port of a bad game. Okay, let's go wrap this up. Phew, that was a lot of games and frankly a ton of work. So what conclusions can we draw now that we've seen every Sega game released on the Amiga platform? Well, I think the main one is that even though there were a lot of Sega games released on the Amiga line of computers, there were not a lot of particularly good ones. There were a few diamonds in the rough to be sure, but the vast majority of them are either substandard or just flat out bad. So how did this happen? Well, there's a few reasons. These games originated in Japan, and when European and American companies approached companies like Sega in Japan to get licenses for Western computers, for the Japanese companies they were kind of an afterthought, and there was no real quality control or anything like that. They just sold the rights and collected the money and let them do their thing. Now usually, a company like Sega, or any company like Capcom or Namco, would not provide game code to anyone actually doing the ports for Western computers. If they were lucky, they'd get an arcade cabinet so that it would at least have something to reference while they were working on the port. But they never had access to the underlying code in those cases. And then on top of that, the teams that made these games were very small. We're talking between like 2 and 5 people in most cases. And on top of that, they also had very tight deadlines, where the publishers would usually say, hey, we need this game in somewhere between 4 and 6 months. Get on it, you 3 or 4 people have to finish it in that amount of time. And then on top of that, most of these games were ports, or at least originally targeted, to the Atari ST line of home computers. And the Atari ST, which shared a 68000 CPU like the Amiga, did not have the same kind of graphical hardware that the Amiga had. So when they ported these games from the ST to the Amiga, they didn't take any advantage of the Amiga's extra horsepower. So take all of those things, throw them into a big pot, mix it up, and you've got yourself a stew of giant problems for Sega ports on the Amiga. Now it's too bad that the Amiga didn't take off or even have a real presence in Japan. If Japanese developers had gotten a hold on the system, the people who made the original games, I think we would have seen much, much better arcade ports to the platform. We saw from many of its original games just how capable that hardware was. And I'm not saying every game would have been perfect, they wouldn't have been, but they would have been much closer had they been more closely based on the source material. So tell me, did you have an Amiga, or 2, or 3, or even more back in those days? Had you had the opportunity to play a lot of these Sega games when they were new on the actual hardware? Are you seeing a lot of them for the first time here today, or any of them? I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments. So that'll do it for this epic video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos when they come out. If you are so inclined, you can support the work I do here either on Patreon or Ko-fi. The links follow at the end of the video and are also down below in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.